Part 2. Imperialism. The motives behind imperialism consisted of power, trade, profit, nationalism, and territory. The leaders of Europe were seeking these things. Characteristics and effects of imperialism. Negative effects included decreased amounts of freedom, resources were taken, increased levels of poverty, and increased dependency on higher countries. Possible positive characteristics and effects included developed infrastructure and schools, hospitals, and legal systems established. There were two main types of imperialism, political and economic. Direct rule meant that the government was made up of representatives of the imperial power, and indirect rule meant that the government was made up of representatives who were cooperating with the imperial powers. Economic imperialism meant the domination of the trading that occurred, as well as the other aspects of the colonized country's economy. Terms associated with imperialism. The sphere of influence was the area over which the imperial country claimed rule. It could be a single nation or multiple. The protectorate was a situation in which a stronger nation protected a weaker nation from imperialism. Southeast Asia was a target of imperialism because many Westerners wanted to have possession over its lands due to their exports. The Pacific Rim was especially rich in resources. It had fertile land, minerals, and oils. The primary exports of Southeast Asia include sugarcane, coffee, cocoa, rubber, coconuts, bananas, and pineapples. The impact of imperialism on Southeast Asia included that the economies grew from increased trade flow, and that communication, education, health, and sanitation all improved. The U.S. was the country that was most involved with the imperialism in Southeastern Asia. It acquired the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam after fighting in the Spanish-American War. The U.S. was interested in Hawaii as well. The U.S. established sugarcane plantations in Hawaii, and the sugarcane plantations eventually accounted for about 75% of Hawaii's wealth. Later, in 1890, the McKinley Tariff Act was passed in the U.S. It eliminated tariffs on sugar entering the U.S., so suddenly producing sugar in Hawaii was no longer cheaper than in other locations, and Hawaii became less desirable. However, the U.S. continued to pursue Hawaii, and it was eventually added to the U.S. Imperialism in India. Imperialism in India started off slow in the first half of the 18th century when the British had various trading posts on the coast. However, in the second half of the 18th century escalated. The British challenged war on India for land starting in the 1750s. They established a military dominance that was powerful enough to help them maintain many decades full of either having complete control over these regions or having their Indian rulers become subordinate allies. They earned this through fighting against the Indians. The British wished to be involved in the imperialization of India because they favored their resources. India's top resources included sugar and indigo dye, but they also offered weaving cloth and raw silk, as well as the service of merchants and bakers. South Africa was also colonized by the British. The British wanted to colonize them because they had territory in the north as well, and they wanted to have the advantage of having land on waters that were trade areas, and because if they owned land in the north and in the south, the land in between the 2 points could become a place of great potential. The scramble for Africa was, by definition, the invasion, occupation, and colonization of Africa. It began after the Berlin Conference in 1884, which regulated European trade in Africa. It changed European rule over Africa from indirect imperialism to the direct rule of colonies. There were many factors that played into the scramble for Africa. First, travel. When people were traveling more, they recognized that other countries had goods that they may want, goods including land. Economics. Having access to a greater number and range of goods would provide revenue and available natural resources. Geopolitics. The areas in which they were trying to conquer were along the lines of major trade routes, which would provide more revenue as well. Nationalism. It was highly respectable to own large pieces of land outside of your own country. And liberalism. The idea of self-improvement, paired with Darwin's newly introduced idea of survival of the fittest, gave the Europeans the impression that they were helping the Africans by conquering their lands and enforcing their traditions and religions. Because the European powers made all of the decisions in the scramble for Africa, the result was messy. Countries were divided randomly, not according to ethnic groups or language barriers, and this caused not only hatred between the Africans and colonists, but also internal unrest between ethnic groups.